Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salam ala Rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Wa assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is Ustadh Amina Blake with you. And now we're going to do, inshallah, today the commentary of Hadith number 1 in ANawawis, ANawawis 40 Hadiths, inshallah ta'ala. So just as a reminder from the last session, the hadith itself, of course, is very famous hadith where the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells us deeds are but by intentions, and every man shall only have what he intended, or shall have only what he intended. So someone whose hijrah was to Allah and his messenger, his hijrah was to Allah and his messenger. And somebody whose hijrah or emigration was to achieve a worldly aim, or to a woman he would marry, then his hijrah was to that for which he emigrated. So this is a reminder about the hadith we're going to be talking about today, inshallah ta'ala. Last session we focused on Nawawi radiallahu anh, and also a little bit on the Bukhari, Imam Bukhari radiallahu anh. But today we're going to be focusing on this hadith itself, the commentary of the hadith. Now, Al-Imam Ahmed radiallahu anh, he said about this hadith, and there are many of the ulama who say very important points about this hadith which we should remember. So first of all, he said that the fundamental foundations of Islam were found in 3 hadiths, and all these 3 hadiths are found in the collection of ANawawis 40 hadith. Number 1 is this one that we're talking about today. Deeds or actions are only but by intention. Number 2 was a hadith from Aisha radiallahu anha, whoever innovates in this matter of ours. So this is one about innovation and putting extra into the deen. And the 3rd one is a hadith of An-Nu'man bin Bashir. And this one is the halal is clear and the haram is clear. Okay, so those are those 3 hadith that Imam Ahmed radiallahu anh mentioned. Now, Al-Bukhari, he's come back into this again, of course. He begins his collection with this hadith, and we have to think about why. It's almost like it's an introduction. So when we look at the living of Islam itself, when we're living Islam, when we're going around doing our everyday deeds, we're doing our salah, we're doing our other types of ibadah, then if we don't have intention, if we don't have correct intention behind it, then actually any deed done without the correct intention is worthless, unless it's done solely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is why this hadith is put first in the collection of Al-Bukhari, because we need the correct intention before we even do the deed. And that's without even talking about the correct intention whilst running through the deed, and still continuing the correct intention after the deed has actually been finished. So it's very important. Now Ash-Shafi'i radiallahu anh says that this hadith is included in 70 subjects of fiqh or understanding, and that it contains 1/3 of ilm, 1/3 of knowledge. So we can see here that the ulama really focus on this hadith because of the huge importance of having the correct intention behind our deeds. It what makes them acts of ibadah contradicted with non-acts of ibadah. Now we'll unpick that a little bit now, inshallah. We'll talk in more detail about that. So what can the reasons for intention be? The niyyah or intention. Now the niyyah is, like we said before, primarily sits in the heart. Now it serves 2 functions. It has 2 things that it can do. Number 1, it defines what one intends with the worship. So, for example, if I get up for Salat al-Fajr, I will go to my Salat and I will intend that I'm going to pray Salat al-Fajr. And the second one, the second reason or second function of the intention is to decide whether this act is one of worship. So this hadith also at the same time talks about ikhlas or sincerity. We must be sincere when we have our intention. Now, what does that mean? It means that we should be truthful and honest. firstly to ourselves, and of course at the same time to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are being honest, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's in our heart. So you can't have an incorrect intention and try and pretend to Allah like it was a correct intention, because it doesn't work that way. So working to constantly try and purify our intentions is definitely something we should be working on all the time, whether before the deed, during the deed, and after the deed as well. Or we can suddenly lose what started off as a really amazing deed and started off as an act of worship that maybe would have got us to Jannah, inshallah. We could end up with it even turning against us and turning into something like shirk or something bad that we've done. So we have to be really, really careful. So ikhlas meaning purity or sincerity of niyyah, of intention, is one of the main conditions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepting our good deeds. So try not to mix your intention up. Make sure it's pure, it's focused, and you keep reminding yourself that this is what I'm doing, this is why I'm doing it, and keep on, because otherwise the shaitan is definitely going to be bothering you all the time and trying to take you off the correct intention, because that's what the shaitan really does very well. Now, the other condition, so first of all, it has to have purity. The other condition is that the action that has ikhlas must be done in accordance with the Sharia, with the Islamic law. Okay. Now, what does that mean in practical terms? It means it must be a deed that is permissible. So you can't do something haram with the best of intention. Okay. It doesn't work that way. It has to be something that is permissible deed. So with this way, we have an amazing opportunity, because that way you can turn something that would be a normal permissible deed that you might not consider as an act of worship, you could turn that into an act of worship just by making the correct intention, inshallah. Because we know that our extra deeds, and this is from another hadith, for our extra deeds and us carry on doing those extra deeds for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is inshallah something that leads to Allah's love. And who doesn't want Allah's love, right? Subhanallah. So the Sunnah, of course, is the manifestation of the Quran, and the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, of course, is the best of our models. He is the model that we should follow to show us how to live the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we're looking at these hadiths, this is what we should definitely intend and definitely try and follow that path. So we have these different stops now on this hadith. What are the conditions of being accepted by Allah as an act of worship? Number one, it should have ikhlas, have purity of intention. Number two, it should be halal or permissible deed. And number three, we should be trying our best to follow the path and the sunnah of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wherever we possibly can. Now, the truth of intention is known only to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's al-ghaib. It's considered as al-ghaib. Al-ghaib, it means part of the unseen. You can't see somebody's intention unless they speak it out to you. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will know what somebody's intention is. They might be doing, you can see maybe a row of people all praying, right? And some of them might be praying purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and have really pure intention. And then actually somebody else might be praying to show off, riya. So they might actually be committing an act of shirk within that prayer, because they're praying to show off to somebody or to other people or whatever, subhanallah. So although people might all be doing the same act, they might not be getting the same result out of it, because they haven't got the same ikhlas, the same purity of intention, niyyah, inside their hearts. Now, Al-Imam Ahmed radiallahu anh again adds and talks about the niyyah. It actually serves as a tool for us to be able to check ourselves, and that we're not doing the deed for anything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there are so many hadiths that tell us and emphasize time after time after time the importance of correct intentions and the consequences of having bad intentions on the Yawm al-Qiyamah. So we can't say, and we won't be able to say on the Day of Judgment, that we haven't been warned. about this. Our intention is key. Now, the hadith begins with the word innama. Innama, it's used in Arabic. It means something that's limited, is only. Innama, or but. So this confirms that the thing that is mentioned excludes everything else. So the action is but by intention. Innama al-a'mal bin-niyyat. So we see that the action is limited by the intention. Now, so it's very important to think about the Arabic text and think about how it's worded. So it's possible that if something's a small act, I don't know, let me give you an example, such as, I don't know, you go wash the car because you want to make your spouse happy, all right? So you go and wash the family car. Maybe you do it yourself, maybe you take it to the car wash. Now, this is a small permissible act. With no intention, it just remains a neutral act. But if you have the intention that you're cleaning the car to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala values marriage and puts the barakah and the rahmah, the mercy and the wid, the affection in marriage, so you're doing that to please Allah by pleasing your spouse, suddenly that act that might have been a bit of a mundane, permissible act that wouldn't necessarily count on the Day of Judgment, suddenly that becomes an act of worship. You're doing it to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you can see that even those little acts of that might not necessarily be salah or big acts of worship, you can make those by changing the intention. As long as they're permissible, you can change your intention and make those count on the scales, the mizan, on Yawm al-Qiyamah, inshallah ta'ala. Now, what's meant by a'mal? A'mal, deeds. Imam ANawawis radiyallahu anh talks about deeds that are obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the deeds that we do that are obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, having that intention. Now, the Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, where he says, and every man shall have what he intended, that we can take another meaning from that. It means that the deed must be specified in our hearts, in our minds. So we must be aware of our intention and what we're doing for Allah in order to get the reward of that particular action. So after that, in the hadith, the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam gives, as he does in so many different hadiths, he gives us examples. And of course, the example here is the emigration. Why? Because that was relevant at the time. This was how was happening. A major thing that was happening in the lives of the companions at the time was the hijrah. So he was there specifying there are two categories of hijrah here. The Islamic one for the cause of the deen, the faith, and the worldly one for any other purpose, whether that's a halal purpose or it's a haram purpose. So the original meaning actually of the word hijrah is to leave something behind. So the hijrah to al-Medina, because it was farad, because some of you might be thinking, okay, well, you know, the guy going to marry a woman, that's not something that is haram. No, of course it's not haram, and he wouldn't have got sins for that. But because the hijrah was farad, it was obligatory on the Muslims to move to al-Medina. And of course, this then had to be as an act of worship, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ordered that the Muslims should do this. The Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said the people should do this. So this is why it needed to have the purest of intention, in order that when the community, the Muslim community, is established in Medina, it's established in the most pure of ways, inshallah ta'ala. So how can we achieve ikhlas? How can we do that? Now, ikhlas is to do righteous deeds. And the more good deeds we do, the closer we get to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, the more sincere we will be, because Allah will help us by placing positivity and reminding us to have good intention and pure intention into our hearts. So it's almost an act of training, that we trust that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will help us with our intention, and the further down the line we get, it will almost become automatic, inshallah ta'ala, that we should always check our intention before. So before you're doing anything, while you're in training, step back. Okay, what is my intention behind this? Do I have a pure intention? Should I be adjusting my intention? Should I be changing it right now to make sure that it does have ikhlas? If you step back just for a moment, just for a second, then so many more of your rewards, inshallah, will count on Yawm al-Qiyamah and count in this scales, the mizan and the weighing of the good and the bad deeds. And this is so important and will be so important in the akhirah, inshallah ta'ala. So we can all think of some actions that we've started with a really good intention, and then because of various things, it might have changed. So Ibn Rajab radiallahu anh says, according to the ulama, if the intention at the end of your action is the same as it was at the beginning, then any changes of intention in the middle, in between, will inshallah be forgiven or doesn't matter. And Allah knows best on this. But we should try really to have good intention all the way through, but definitely to match the beginning and the end. And then if we did the intention and we broke it, then we should make tawbah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and keep on correcting it and correcting it and correcting it. Now, intention can be made in the heart, or it can be made in the heart and out loud. And so some intentions, like we said before, must be made out loud, and some of them don't need to be. Now, some of the rulings or ahkam which scholars have taken from this hadith. So, for example, we've all heard people saying wallahi, right? Some people say wallahi and they're swearing by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's a really big thing. When people swear by Allah, saying wallahi every now and then, and their intention is not that they are actually swearing by Allah, they just simply say it out of culture or habit. I mean, nowadays you even hear non-Muslims saying wallahi, right? Subhanallah, because they picked it up as part of the culture. It readily rolls off, okay? So if it's just readily rolling off their tongue, and they don't understand what they're saying, then many of the ulama will say that this is harmless. However, a Muslim should do our best to minimize it, because it suggests that we don't really have an Allah-centric brain or heart if we are letting Allah's name roll off our tongues, like this inshallah that people use, and they don't really mean inshallah. It's just like a cultural thing, and they're probably not going to do what they said inshallah about anyway. Again, when somebody makes an oath or a promise, what's judged is his intention when he or she makes an oath or a promise. Now, there can be a combination of intentions when performing ibadah, worship, and teaching others. So we can perform an act of worship for the sake of Allah, but we can also do it with the intention of teaching others. So, for example, when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam performed the Hajj, he did it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as an act of worship, ibadah, as well as teaching the Sahaba radiallahu anhum how to do the Hajj. So that would suggest that there is a dual intention. All of those intentions are pure, and all of them will please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help and support our hearts and our minds in this beautiful journey. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Until next time, inshallah.